Good day, guys. This is Ohio Dan. I wanted to introduce the next topic that I consider to be a red pill idea, and that is the understanding that most people are pretty much slaves to their biology. Now, I want to give a quick explanation of why this is a red pill. I've talked about before how a red pill is basically an understanding of a concept that expresses a fundamental truth about human nature, male and female nature, the way that the world works, that most people are either not aware of or they deliberately act like it's not the case because it's inconvenient for the way that society is structured, or something very similar to that. And in this case, you have a lot of people that want to talk about how we can learn from our mistakes and we can rise above our nature and we can do the right thing and we can evolve. That's true, technically speaking, but that's not what you get in practice in most cases. Despite all the discussion about how people are rational and evolved creatures, potentially at least, the majority of humans will continue to make decisions based on motivation from their biological desires, their base motivations. What basically motivates most people is what seems to be in their interest at the time, what their dick is telling them to do in some cases, or a woman that is attracted to a man because of his potential alpha male status or the money and resources that he has. That's just one example that I talk about often on my channel and that we talk about in the men's community. But most people are like this pretty much across the board. And this kind of dovetails to a degree with what I said in my last red pill video, that most people are amoral. But in this case, I'm not talking about things really from a moralistic perspective, but just what you can expect people to be motivated by and what people are not really motivated by. For the most part, people are motivated by their basic desires. Can I get a good meal? Can I get laid? Can I get what I want that makes me happy at a basic level? And sometimes, of course, a lot of the time, it's more complex than this, but you can still break it down into these basic biological desires, these very visceral things that motivate us. I know some people don't like to say that we're just like animals, but they kind of are, at the very least, similar to animalistic desires or goals, right? Food, shelter, you could say companionship. You could look at the Maslow hierarchy of needs and kind of pick out various things that fall into this description. Sure, some things are more necessary than others, but it really boils down to that. And most people are not motivated by, as I've discussed before, doing the right thing or making a choice that goes against how they feel. Most people are not going to develop beyond just doing what they've kind of been programmed to do, right? And it's not pure instinct. It's also what people are programmed to do, what they're indoctrinated to do over time. That's a big part of it. But people basically follow their programming. Very few people step out of that and actually truly start to think for themselves. Very few people make decisions based on anything that approaches an objective way of thinking. Most people basically want to eat, they want to sleep, they want to fuck, they want to have shelter, they want to be able to de-stress. You could add a lot of things to that, like companionship and things that go up further on Maslow's hierarchy, but still, it is pretty much based on biology. It's not based on some higher function. I do believe that people can individually, if they truly dedicate themselves to it, move beyond this. But the point is that you can count on most people not doing this. That's just what I've seen. This idea that, for example, political ideology, people can get beyond their selfishness. People can get beyond what's just good for them and look at the community and do things for others. Therefore, our political theory, Marxism, is that people will just support each other and will be willing to do more work but not get paid as much as somebody else that does less, and they'll be okay with that because the community is important to them. Other people are just as important. No. that's not the way it works. That's why things like Marxist ideology fail, because human nature, the darker aspects of human nature, come out, and you realize that people will just take advantage of the system for the most part. People are not going to be concerned with doing things for a higher reason if they're not meeting their needs, if they're not being rewarded for their hard work, if there's essentially no reason for them to participate in something like a long-term relationship or marriage from a guy's point of view today. The only reason that men still do is because they want sex and they want companionship, right? All this pretty much boils down, at least for most people, to these basic desires. And sure, you could say that people that are trying to do things for higher reasons, their basic desires are still important, but you can at least try to refine them and try to think about other people's needs and actually be a selfless person. But you've got to do that in the right context. And today's world just wants to take advantage of that for the most part too, which further encourages people not to go beyond this, not to go beyond what their sort of basic desires and their basic biological programming tells them to do. And as long as people can have a hot meal, have a shower, right, get attention from the opposite sex, have something to do that they make money off of, even if they may not particularly like it, as long as people can still be encouraged or facilitated toward doing those things, then people will probably accept a lot. You can kind of abuse people's rights, and most people aren't going to stand up against that because they're still able to go through their basic biological process each day. But when you tell people, oh, there's no more food, there's no clean water, there's no way to actually have a guaranteed shelter because homes are really expensive, there's no way to have companionship because that's so one-sided in favor of one party against the other, and the state is basically in your bedroom now. When you start to mess with that, that is when people rise up. And that's why, to a large extent, no one really cares about men's issues in mainstream society, because they can continue as long as their basic needs are being met, until one day they wake up and realize that not only have a lot of their rights been taken away in many cases, but now it's harder to make a living. It's harder to get food. Food's really expensive. Right now, water for most people may not be as big of an issue, but eventually that may get too expensive. And then what are you going to do? Some people probably are struggling with water bills and electric bills being too high. And when you can't have your basic needs met, like shelter, electricity you could almost include as a basic need because so many other things are dependent on having some electrical source now. Sure, people could go from that back to a time before then, but it wouldn't happen all at once. And so I don't want to ramble about this too much, but it's really only when you start messing with people's needs at a basic level that they respond. The rest of the time, most people will just go along with the flow. Most people don't really care about a lot of stuff. They'll virtue signal, they'll talk about what the right thing is, and then they'll do things like give up their guns and give up their free speech anyway, if we're being honest. I know some of you guys won't do that, but I feel like you're the exception. A lot of people, most people, will just do whatever as long as they're having their basic needs met, right? It's certainly possible for individual people to rise above this, but this process is challenging and requires a level of effort that most people don't typically express unless it's absolutely demanded of them, and oftentimes not even then. You see how people, for example, will be in poor health, just flat out overeating. Let's just take that as an example. Someone may weigh 400 pounds because they eat too much, and then they start to have heart problems. Then they start to have diabetes. Maybe they have a heart attack or a mild stroke, and they still eat themselves into oblivion because to them, all that matters is I want food. I'm sorry to say it, but a lot of people are just that way. They don't have that mindset of trying to get beyond, hey, I need to be doing something else here. I need to be more disciplined because if I continue to eat this way, I'm going to die very soon. A lot of people can't even do it even then. And so it's rare, I think, to encounter people that actually go through this process because it's difficult, right? Our biological desires are quite strong. This is, again, a reason why men have not really abandoned womankind to a large extent at this point, because men want sex, men want companionship, Men want, unconsciously in many cases, to have children. In some cases, it is consciously a drive to have children. And so they don't just say, wait a second, we basically have a two-tier system where women can do whatever they want, and I, as the guy, potentially have to take responsibility. And I'm oversimplifying a bit, but that's largely how it is, in the West at least. So why would I engage in this process? Why would I try to get copulation, achieve that, with someone that can make an accusation that she didn't consent later on and withdraw her consent after the fact? Or get married to a woman that ends up taking your house and taking half your stuff? Why would you do that just to copulate? Well, because people are driven mostly by their basic biological desires. That's why. Plus the social indoctrination that's what men should want to do. So, unfortunately, possibilities like discovering new truths and creating a logical system where people can generally succeed based on what I've talked about here, based on people being more enlightened, more able to be disciplined and focus on the high end of what human nature is capable of, unfortunately, this will usually take a back seat to things like money, sex, and prestige. That's just where it stands. And this idea that people have evolved beyond that and people are no longer beholden to that is just nonsense. Most people seem to believe that, yes, we can get beyond these basic aspects of our nature, but yet they don't. Overall in society, that's not what's happening. And so any sort of concept of what's likely to occur in the future needs to basically include that. Unless we someday find a way to overcome this focus on fulfilling our base desires, this will continue to be a limitation on what we can feasibly do involving other people as it applies across many issues. In other words, you can count on people basically not achieving this for the most part. Your average people in society, as things stand now at least within the human species, are not going to do this. Most people are just going to go along with whatever motivates them based on their desire to eat, drink, sleep, have resources, have sex, and so forth. That's pretty much where it stands for most people, if we're being honest. Men and women, to be honest. In my opinion, the correct approach then is to factor this consideration into any proposed solution for problems involving humans on a wide scale, right, on a general basis. Any sort of thought process that says, oh, we can just rise above our nature and then we'll be able to resolve this problem, you can guarantee pretty much that it's not going to work, because that's not how most people function. If we do not acknowledge this, in my opinion, we will fail to implement any desired change if we just assume that humans will somehow rise above their natural tendencies and begin making choices based on logic or virtue alone, without the self-interest, based on the things that I've mentioned in this video. You can pretty much guarantee that it's not going to happen. Now, I'm going to make a part 2 to this, where I talk about more of the practical applications of this, kind of within the political, legal sphere, but just overall how it affects society, because there are things going on in society that have warped these basic biological interests into something that is causing problems. It's going to make things worse. And I'm going to talk about that in part 2, but I'm going to conclude this part of the video right here with the idea that it is pretty much a red pill that most people are slaves to their basic biology. They're not going to do anything to overcome those basic interests. And if you have a plan that somehow doesn't acknowledge that for society, or a vision that says that people are just going to evolve beyond that, it's not really going to be based on anything valid, in my opinion. The red pill is that people, for the most part, there are individuals that can rise above this, but for the most part, people make their decisions and do things based on wanting to eat, sleep, have sex, have companionship, have water, have food, and it's really only when people can't do that anymore that they actually react. If you tell them that it's the right thing to do something or not, they're not going to care. What they're going to be motivated by are those basic interests based on their biology. And for most people, you're not going to see them evolve beyond that to amount to anything, because that's just not how human nature works. And despite the denial of that in some cases by ideology, by different belief systems, by people that have this sort of idea that people are always good, that people are always going to put these higher values ahead of their own needs. It's just not going to happen. And so most people are pretty much slaves to their biology. And I think that it's important that we recognize that before we try to jump ahead and have a solution for a human problem at a macro level that's not consistent with recognizing this.